endocrine system, talking about hormonal adaptations to resistance training. Okay, and so here are two objectives. It's the same as with the neuromuscular, with the energy systems. It'll be the same with cardiorespiratory, but we want to focus on what these adaptations are to anaerobic training and what the benefits are. So we're going to go through 4 or 5 hormones here. So the first one is testosterone. Now with each of these hormones, I want you to remember what acute exercise does and what training does. And so this is both during rest or not, and then during exercise. So when we have acute exercise, testosterone levels increase, but once exercise is done, the concentrations go back to normal. So how does training affect this? Well, training doesn't change anything at rest, but it does seem to, or it appears to lead to greater concentrations in resistance athletes compared to aerobic athletes during acute exercise. And it's believed that testosterone might help with these neural adaptations. Okay, remember how we talked about the initial gains we get from strength or from these neural adaptations. It's believed that testosterone helps with that. Next, we've got growth hormone, and growth hormone is complicated. And so we're not going to dive deep into this or any of them, but growth hormone is complicated because there's several different types of growth hormone and several different receptor types. And so it's hard to keep track of and isolate what's causing what and that sort of thing. So similar to testosterone, growth hormone concentration increases during acute exercise. It appears to be correlated with lactate. Once exercise ends, though, concentrations go back to normal. Also similar to testosterone, training doesn't seem to affect anything during rest. However, during exercise, more growth hormone is released after training, and this is also correlated with hypertrophy of the muscle fibers. Remember that correlation, and we've got 2 correlations here, that correlation doesn't, I'll just highlight these real quick. So correlation and correlation doesn't mean that one is causing the other. So just because growth hormone is correlated with lactate concentration doesn't mean that growth hormone is causing the increase in lactate concentration or vice versa. And the same with fiber hypertrophy. But there's some evidence to suggest that there is a relationship. Then we've got insulin-like growth factor. And what does this do? It stimulates growth in cells. Just to remind you, because I think we talked about this during the endocrine system, it's a growth hormone or a growth factor. It's called insulin-like because of its structure, not because it does anything like insulin. Now, during acute exercise, there's a delayed response, and this response is tied to growth hormone. Similar to the other hormones that we've talked about, training doesn't change the resting concentrations, and similar to growth hormone, there's a lot of interactions that it has with other hormones that make it difficult to parse out what exactly insulin-like growth factor is causing. Is it causing these changes on its own, or is it because it's in combination with other hormones, or is it just because it's correlated with other hormones? Then we've got cortisol. Remember, cortisol is the stress hormone, the long-term stress hormone. Like all of these, during exercise, we have increased concentration. It, too, is correlated with lactate concentration. And like the others, once exercise ends, concentrations go back to normal. And that should make sense, right? Cortisol is a stress hormone. Exercise is a stressor. When we get rid of that stressor, concentrations go back to normal. When it comes to training, like all the others, training doesn't seem to affect the amount of cortisol we have floating around in our body when we're not exercising. All right, and then the last one, we've got our short-term stress hormones, so epi and norepi. As you should know, when we start to exercise, so acute exercise, it's a stressor. We release lots of epi and norepi. During training or because of training, doesn't change resting concentrations. However, when we are at max exercise, we release more of epi and norepi. And it's kind of the first to respond, which makes sense. We talked about the autonomic nervous system, and when you have your fight or flight, these hormones are released. And these hormones also affect the other hormones or several of the other hormones that we've talked about. So testosterone, growth hormone, insulin-like growth factor. It could be a stimulus for these hormones. Okay, so generally speaking, During acute exercise, all of these hormone concentrations increase. Most of them go back to normal relatively quickly once exercise ends. Training doesn't appear to affect resting exercise or resting concentrations, but in some cases it affects what's released during exercise.